All right, ladies and gentlemen, if I can welcome you back to Constructive Disorder. I'm Adam Posen, president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and it's my pleasure to reconvene for the final session of our conference on income inequality and inclusive growth. And of course, we have the privilege of having a address, a speech, a presentation, something which will make us think from Paul Krugman. Again, the joke about no introduction needed, but importantly, Paul has followed his political and economic policy interests, not just as columnist in the New York Times, but has joining the CUNY's Stone Center in Socioeconomic Inequality in 2015, where he's a core faculty member concentrating on these issues. He, of course, previously served on the faculties of Princeton, MIT, Yale, and Stanford. In 2008, Professor Krugman was the sole recipient of the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences for his work on international trade theory. I'm going to just very briefly make two small personal observations before asking Paul to come to the fore. Many of us in the economics profession go through life sort of watching the people who are our intellectual heroes, and then when you get to know them or you watch what they actually do, feeling really overwhelmed. I have that problem now with Olivier Blanchard in the next door office. But it was very interesting. I actually took heart from being overwhelmed by Paul Krugman at times, because back in 1997-98, I decided to work on Japan as an instance of the 30s, and turned out Paul was doing that, and with a brilliant model of the irresponsibility. I decided to work on fiscal policy in Europe, and it turned out Paul was doing that, and reminding us about Peter Kennan as and fiscal policy as being a possible Achilles heel for the euro area. And then when I was at the Bank of England, I decided to make a big push for quantitative easing and fighting passivity on monetary policy. And it turned out Paul was working on that too. And his work, of course, in each case had a little more impact. But the good news was it made it feel like we were on the right track. And similarly, it's great, even though it is a great challenge for all of us now, to have Paul, in a sense, also on the track that the Institute, my colleagues and I are on about worrying about these issues. The second thing which Paul suffers through every couple of years when he's good enough to come speak is I have to remind the world that when Fred Bergston was running the shop, Paul was brought into the Peterson Institute now almost 30 years ago to co-author a book with our mutual friend, the late Monty Graham, on foreign direct investment in the United States. And I think this was one of Paul's first more popular efforts, and it went through multiple editions and was very important at the time to the discussion of inward investment from Japan and other foreigners in the U.S. And so it is, everyone wants to claim a piece of Paul, but I want to be sure that people know the Peterson Institute has our own piece of longstanding. Without further intro, Paul Krugman.
Okay, so I am now at the as Adam said, I'm now sitting at the what is only about a month and a half, I guess, the Stone Center for Socioeconomic Inequality, which was previously the New York office of LIS, Luxembourg Income Study, and we have a tiny group, but choice. So Janet Gornick, director of the whole shebang, Leslie McCall, political science and sociology, terrific work, and Branko Milanovic, who is our has really done pioneering, enormously influential work. And I was asked to speak at this. So my role at LIS, or I guess I say Stone Center. My role at Stone Center, you see, habits take some time to change. My role is less that of a deep original researcher, as someone to bounce stuff off. I guess a little bit of a rainmaker, so it's a great setting. And among other things, I find that I learn a lot from talking to colleagues. And when I was asked to talk at this event on inequality, I thought this was a chance to build on some of the discussions that I've been having with Janet and Branko about the sort of global perspective. And one thing about that approach right now is that it lets me take maybe 20 minutes of vacation from U.S. political events. We will come back to it. Obviously, all of us are finding it a hard time not to think about it all the time. Maybe a little bit, though, of a broader context and some speculations. Also, of course, I have the great luxury now, being an older statesman or whatever it is I am now, of presenting thoughts, speculations, and questions that I don't actually answer. So this is not going to be any kind of definitive research project by a very long shot, but it's maybe hope that makes people think a little bit, and it gives you kind of things that I think about when I'm trying not to think about our own election. So, all right. So now the elephant diagram, the elephant curve. For those of you who don't know, this is Branko Milanović's remarkable contribution to the way we think about global inequality. And the way to put it, if you'd asked me until I saw this work, here's the question: is we know that inequality has risen a lot in the United States and to a lesser extent in other advanced countries, but from a global point of view, is inequality rising or falling? And the answer to that question has clearly been yes. If you are looking across countries, we've actually had a remarkable convergence. We've had a remarkable success of some previously very poor countries who are no longer as poor relative to the first world as once they were. Of course, but if we look within advanced countries and within some developing countries as well, you see substantial increases in inequality. And so the question, it's not a one-dimensional story. There's something going on that is more complicated, and often the way we describe it is as as I just did. You've got instead of an answer, you have a kind of a paragraph that's kind of discursive, and it can be very confusing. It's not the most easiest, most grateful way to talk about what's happening in the world. And what the elephant curve, I've never actually, doesn't look too much like an elephant to me, but anyway, there it is. This is what Branko did, which involves far more effort. By the way, it's supposed to be, I guess, the back of the elephant, and then there's the trunk over there to the right or something. Involves far more effort than it sounds like, is to piece together the available data on income distribution within countries, which is what LIST does, and our growth of economies, and ask how, if we just lined up all the people in the world in 1988 by income, and then asked how does each percentile of that distribution, how has income at that percentile of this distribution changed since then, we can get a picture of changes. So this is percentage changes in real income by percentile of global income distribution, and you see it's a twin-peaked story, not a single piece. There is a dramatic rise in at around a little bit above the median. So a dramatic rise for previously very poor people, and which is point A, and as Branko likes to say, it's basically the Chinese middle class. And then there is another peak, which is the global 1%. Now, the global 1% is quite a lot bigger than the OECD 1%, and so if we were going to look within that, there would be, if we were able to do it, it's probably a peak that's substantially higher even than that. But we know that what you can see, and walking along the southeast corner of Central Park or Mayfair, is the surge in incomes among a relatively small number of people in the world at that end. And it's having this graph in mind gives you a much more comprehensive, I think a better picture. It just gives you the right language. It's really not actually very helpful to talk about a global Gini coefficient or anything else, because there's a lot more going on, but what's going on is not that complicated. It's really these two developments. It also says that if you're asking what are these changes things that are good or bad, or from some point of cosmopolitan social welfare function, the answer is, well, the rise at A is a very good thing. There's those people who are in some cases barely above subsistence, who are now actually having the possibility of decent life. On the other hand, you don't like what's happening at point B, which is the OECD working class, if you like, is seeing some people really left behind. And that, in turn, may have not just means some stagnation of living standards, but may also have social and political effects that are pretty alarming. And there's a huge dispute now about to what extent is what we see at B responsible for what's been happening in the political process here and elsewhere, which I'm not going to be, it's certainly not my goal to answer here, but it's certainly part of our story. Now, one thing that is, however, a little bit of a problem in doing this kind of in presenting the elephant curve is it's a global picture, and there's an immediate tendency to say, and this is telling you what globalization does. And that's a little bit of an intellectual sleight of hand, or maybe it's just an accidental word game. The fact that this is what happens globally doesn't mean that globalization is what did it. This could be for completely different reasons. It could be that something has happened that is not globalization, that has made it possible for developing countries, some developing countries, to achieve this extraordinary growth. Now, I will argue in a bit. I think that it's hard to tell the story about that great takeoff without some kind of global, some kind of world trade focus. But it's much more questionable whether the rise of the 1% is a globalization story. To the extent that we have it's actually there's an interesting. I'll talk about this a bit more. There's a question about how much, in general, growing trade should be seen as a reason for the rise in inequality within advanced countries, and that's a debate that has been proceeding for quite a long time. It looks a little bit less clear than I thought when I first got into that debate, but that's partly because that debate really seemed to be quite hot in the early 1990s, which is very near the beginning of this picture, and it looks quite different if we look at it right now. Before I get to all that, suppose that we at least hold provisionally in our minds the possibility that this is a story. It is an integrated story, not just a descriptive thing, but this is a process. This is globalization at work. One question we might ask is, isn't it always thus? Aren't there always rising nations? Isn't there always, the rich get richer and the poor have children, whatever. There's something going on up there. And that's actually a question that we can more or less answer. And I don't think this has been widely disseminated. But I actually asked Branko, who is the guy who does this stuff, I asked him, can you do this diagram for an earlier period? And it's not easily done at all. The data are much worse if you go back. But there was enough that he could produce a scrappy but rough estimate. And this is what the similar curve looks like over a not quite disjunct, but a different period. So in this case, unfortunately, instead of saying percentiles, it's ventiles. Those are five percentage point increments of the income distribution. And the point being that if you look at the period from 1970 up to about 1990, it doesn't look at all like the picture that everyone now, the Milanovic story. It looks, this is also a Milanovic story, but it doesn't look like the elephant diagram. It is, in fact, a picture of a relatively flat process of income changes. in the world. It's one in which income growth was substantial, but similar for basically everybody. Now the data are scrappy, but this has to be. It actually makes a lot of sense once you see it. If we look back in that period, income distribution in advanced countries, the United States already had a significant rise in inequality, but much less so in the rest of the OECD. So you wouldn't have expected to see all that much. You wouldn't have expected to see the 1% there. And it's possible that the data are not capturing the rise of the 1% in the U.S. And at the same time, we did not have the spectacular takeoff of economic growth for a large part of the world's population. At that point, we used to talk about the East Asian economic miracle, but what we meant at the time was Singapore and Hong Kong and South Korea and Taiwan, and a little bit some others. But that was in fact, I'm old enough to remember when we would look at the success of the small East Asian countries and saying, well, this is possible because they can export a lot of stuff. But imagine what would happen if China tried to go down that route. Not possible. And it turned out, well, actually, it was possible. But the important point is that we seem to be in a quite different. That looks like there's a regime break. There's a change in the process of global whatever's going on in the process of global income growth, where we went from. In a way, it's a little bit. Well, no, I shouldn't say it's the. If you are familiar, as I guess almost everyone in this room is, if you're familiar with U.S. income distribution over the whole post-World War II period, we know that there's two eras. There's a first era when it looks like a picket fence. All groups are growing at about the same rate. And then there's a second era when it looks like a staircase with very low at the bottom and very, very high at the top. And globally, it doesn't become a staircase. It becomes something a little more like a roller coaster or an elephant. But but there is, again, a big shift in regime. Now, I asked Branko to do this one for a reason, because I had a suspicion that there might be something, partly because I knew something about what has happened to the process of globalization itself. So just on the adopting as in the subjunctive, if it were the case that this is about globalization, we know that globalization post-1990 has looked quite different from globalization pre-1990. And I'll have more to say about that in a bit, but just to give you, this is just the World Bank goods and services exports as a percent of global GDP. And while it's true that the trade was rising before 1990, it's risen a lot more since then. And as I'll show you in a bit later, it's also risen, even up to about 1990, trade was not out of historically precedented. It was not unprecedented. There was a great U shape in world trade. We'll see more of that in a minute. Between 1913 and the 1970s, with trade declining a great deal in the interwar period and then recovering after World War II. But even as late as the 1980s, it wasn't really out of the range of what we'd had before. Since then, something really dramatic and new has happened. And there's also, which I couldn't find an easy way to do in the charts, there's also a change in the character of trade and manufactured goods in particular. Up through the 80s, a large part of manufacturers' trade growth was intra-industry trade among advanced countries. It was rich countries selling broadly similar stuff to each other. And then the huge growth of trade, of north-south trade in manufactured goods. Is something that has already begun on some levels in the 1970s, but that's in a relatively small part of the world. It really takes off after about 1990. So there is a big, a real change in the process of globalization. All right, so we have, we have basically one observation here. We have a period of one kind of global economy gives way to another kind of global economy in terms of trade flows. And then we also see a transformation of trade patterns. Of trade patterns are transformed, but we see a transformation of what appears to be the dynamic on income, which doesn't, it's one observation. So, but at least there's a little bit of a correlation there in that very narrow sense. Oh, and one thing I should say, which is important, I think, if we're trying to look forward, is if you look at the end there, you see, trade plunged during the Great Recession, bounced back, but has not continued its upward trend. It's so now how much of that is a secular slowdown? The trade is not going to grow as it did in the past, and how much it's just one of those things that happens. I will make the case that it actually is that we have an era of a particular kind of globalization, of the hyperglobalization, which is, I think, Arvind Subramanian's phrase originally done here, it's real. That we actually are seeing that was a one-time event. There was an era. And if so, that has possibly some implications for where we go from here. Okay. All right. I realized, of course, probably almost everybody presumably knows what I mean here. It's one of the odd things about trade is that the public perception of what economists have to say about it, and maybe what some economists do tend to say to the public and what's actually in the field are quite different. Trade theory is not, in fact, optimistic that everyone gains automatically from free trade. On the contrary, back in the cutting-edge modern work, Wolfgang Stolper and Paul Samuelson in 1941 showed that, in fact, it's very likely, indeed the norm, that not only will trade have large effects on income distribution, but those effects will typically swamp any aggregate gains. That if you open trade with a country that has different factor abundances than you do, it's very likely that your scarce factor will in fact be hurt by the opening of trade. So it could be capital and labor, it could be highly educated versus less educated workers. Large income distribution effects are actually what standard simple trade models say you should expect to see happen. They can get around it in various ways. You can argue that there are sufficiently large non-factor related sources of comparative advantage, just big differences in technology, or that there's a lot of economies of scale based trade, which is what at least I spent a good part of my life arguing was the story about trade growth in the 50s and 60s and 70s. So to that extent, you can reverse it. But the idea that you can have large income distribution effects on trade, large income distribution effects from trade, is very much something that fits within our standard paradigm. And if you see that we had a big growth in trade, you see that there were some big movements in income distribution, maybe those are linked stories. Okay. Now, we used to have there was a lot of discussion about trade and income distribution more than 20 years ago. One of the odd things about it is, again, people talk as if this is all new stuff. It's not. There was a quite intense discussion with quite a lot of quantitative work attempting to assess the impact of growing trade on income distribution back in the late 80s, early 90s. And in fact, was trying to do a literature search. I'm finding it really hard to find quantitative estimates that have been made since then. Most of the estimates that tried to put a number to the effect of trade on, let's say, on blue-collar wages seem to be papers from no later than 1995, 1996. Kind of an odd thing, actually. When that literature was done, several things. The general conclusion was that if you were honest about it, yes, probably trade was depressing blue-collar wages. That imports of labor-intensive manufacturing goods from what at the time were low-wage countries like South Korea were, in fact, having some negative impact on the wages of workers with less education in the United States. But that there was just no way to make it a really big number. And the reason was that the trade wasn't big enough. Analytically, importing labor-intensive products and exporting capital or skill-intensive products is as if you are a closed economy having an influx of less educated workers. You can do a mapping between the two, but the quantities were just the implied, the embodied. The embodied imports of labor services and imports were just not big enough to produce more than a few percent change in real wages. So it just didn't look big enough. There was a second story which was already somewhat apparent. It's actually kind of shocking how many of the things we think of as being new themes in our political discussion were actually already there by the end of the Reagan years. The 1%. Was the issue of the 1%. There was already what we thought was an explosive growth in incomes for the 1% back in the 80s. We had no idea, right? It's these days Gordon Gekko looks like a piker, but but that was always hard to fit into a trade story. Very easy to tell a story about how education levels, the return to education is affected by trade. But how does that hedge fund managers and high school teachers have similar levels of formal education, not exactly similar levels of income growth over the past 30 years. So how do you tell that story? And the third was that the third objection to this whole line of discussion was the argument that if it were really just about the standard trade stuff, we should be seeing growing inequality in advanced countries, but we should be seeing declining inequality in developing countries. Which, by the way, in the first stages of the transformation, of the rise of manufactured exports from developing countries, seemed to be the case. When you looked at what happened in Taiwan or South Korea as they opened up to the world, they also seemed to have growing income equality. They seemed to have decline in their disparities. But if we looked at the later phases, we looked at what had happened in China, or even what happened in Mexico, where there was a striking move towards trade liberalization, opening up, a shift from being mostly a raw materials and tourism exporter to being a very large manufacturing exporter. You also saw a jump in inequality. Inequality seemed to be rising everywhere. Okay, that, however, is all, almost all of that discussion is about 20 years old. It's based on what people saw, and pretty much before the elephant curve really starts to apply, or in the very early stages of it. So what we have right now are reasons to say, look, the numbers, the world has changed a lot since that discussion. So this, I actually pulled this up from, I didn't have time to redo it, so I pulled this up from a Brookings paper I did about 8 years ago. Which gives you a little bit of a picture. So this is manufactured exports to the United States as a share of GDP. And when we were all doing these numbers aren't that big analyses, that's pretty much at the left side of the graph, when developing countries accounted for only about 2% of GDP. And it's now even a bit higher than at the end of that. So we've seen a sort of tripling of the developing country share. Another way to put this is that when many of these studies were done, the average country with which we traded using manufacturers trade as a weight was 80%, 75% of U.S. wage levels. It's dropped a lot since then. It's way down the scale. So we really have seen a big increase. Now you might say, well, okay, why don't we just go and redo these calculations about the effect? That turns out to be a nasty technical problem, because the way that you typically do these things is you try to you use industry level data on factor intensities to estimate the implied import of unskilled labor. Less educated labor. The trouble now is if you do those kinds of things, you find that what developing countries are selling to the United States in general looks quite skill intensive and capital intensive. But it isn't actually. What's happening is we've had the vertical disintegration of production, so that you're importing a relatively high-tech good from China, but the Chinese component of it is not the high-tech parts. And it's extremely difficult to sort that. It's very hard to get anything that looks like a plausible estimate. So there's a reasonable case now that the numbers on the income distribution effect of trade are substantially bigger than what we used to estimate. Not that the old calculations were wrong, but that was more than 2 decades ago, and the world has moved on. A more positive point to make is that the argument, well, if it's really Stolper Samuelson, then why is inequality rising in the developing countries that are exporting manufactured goods? Well, the answer is actually, by and large, it's not anymore. And that varies quite a lot, and the data are. My understanding is that China is not on the list database yet because there are some questions about the data. Surprise! But if you look at Mexico, a large part of the argument, Mexico, NAFTA was not the crucial moment. For Mexico, it was actually this huge trade liberalization between 85 and 88 that was done unilaterally that really opened Mexico up. And then NAFTA kind of locked in the integration with the U.S. economy. And inequality shot up during the trade liberalization. Since then, however, it has come down, at least some, actually significantly. One of the things that happened up until at least quite recently was that in Latin America in particular, there was a substantial decline in inequality. Inequality doesn't always rise everywhere, and in fact, it came down substantially. This lays open various arguments that said, look, what we were seeing was a kind of transitional shock. The rise in income inequality in developing countries is not the enduring effect of integrating with the world economy, but it's a combination. In the case of Mexico, we would have said there was a kind of almost labor aristocracy of organized workers earning good wages in protected manufacturing sectors, which got sort of demolished. But once that thing was passed, maybe you return to something that looks more like what a standard trade model would produce. There's also, I have to say, and we're looking at Latin American countries, programs of deliberate attempts to ameliorate inequality played a big role. One of the many sad things out there is that in Brazil, there was a lot of progress made on that front, and now they've had their own problems of political regime, and I haven't seen any new numbers, but I'm quite pessimistic about the outlook there. So you can certainly make the case that we certainly don't have a proof that globalization has been the whole driver of the elephant curve, but it's a better case than it might have seemed based upon what we used to say about the subject. Still doesn't get you at the 1%. Still doesn't get you at the extreme rise in incomes at the top of the income distribution in the advanced world. And so I would be very hesitant to say that this is the whole story, but it looks stronger than it used to. Which then raises the question, okay, but where do we go from here? And actually, there's two kinds of where do we go from here. The story that I would have told if we'd had this conference 2 weeks ago, and the story I'll tell now. But let's just talk first about what's underlying, and doesn't seem to have that much to do with the politics. So the question is, do we expect this era of ever-growing globalization to continue? Do we expect it to be something that is an enduring feature? And that's interesting. There's supposed to be more slides here. I'm hoping. Hello. I'm hoping to have... No, somehow or other we lost my last several slides. Well, that makes it hard to tell. All right, let me give you. I'm gonna. Yes, I can. Not the greatest, but I can wave in front of you what the slide that was supposed to be there looks like. So, okay, I'll do this in a minute. Sorry about this. I don't know, maybe it's probably my fault. All right. Oh, you know what? I know what happened. I'm sorry. No, there's still a couple more that should be there. I don't know. All right. Here's a different index, which is the ratio of a ratio of an index of manufacturers' trade to an index of manufacturers' production worldwide. It's one that it's available. The UN has data up through 1960, and then you can switch over to WTO data thereafter. You can see what it looks like just there. It's a what you see is that there was as you would expect, there was a quite high level on the eve of World War I, which dropped a lot. So this is only manufacturers' trade. It dropped a lot. So if you set 1950 equals 1, it was roughly 2 in 1913. And then over the course of the interwar period and the wars, it dropped to about 1. So manufacturers' trade to manufacturing production dropped to about half of its pre-World War I level by the years just after World War II. It then went back up, but even as late as the late 1980s, it was still short of 3. So in fact, the share of world manufacturers' production that was traded internationally was not much higher in the 1980s than it had been in 1913, which is an interesting, little different from what we normally expect from the story we often tell ourselves. It's funny. I remember from. At some point, Bill Clinton said something about, well, in the old days, people stayed near the town they were born in, and we didn't have all this global economy, and that's just not right. It was actually the pre-World War I world had a surprising amount of human and capital, and to a certain extent, goods mobility. Hjalmar Schacht, the economic guru of an unfortunate regime in the 30s. Full name was Hjalmar Harris Greeley Schacht because his father lived in Chicago for a while. So it was much more of a global economy than we now think. However, at this point, that index is about 6. From 1990 up till about 2010, you have an explosion in the volume of world manufacturers' trade. So for the first time, we see something that is really on a different scale from what we had before. And if you ask the question, what was that about? Well, it's mostly about vertical disintegration of production. It's mostly about not just shipping a final good, but shipping a piece of a good and then doing stuff to it and then another step and so on. Which is something new in world trade. And it's if you had to ask why did that happen, but a couple of things. One is technology, which is partly, maybe to some extent communication, internet helping to coordinate stuff. A lot of it just has to do with containerization, which is kind of a boring technology, but actually amazingly important. Not so much reducing the cost of shipping as reducing the cost of getting things on and off ship and making it possible to have a complex multi-stage production process without losing track of the stuff or having them pilfered by various people in the port. So that, but also very importantly, a huge change in trade policy, not so much in advanced countries as developing countries, as a bunch of them shift away from import substitution to to outward-looking policies, and so you have a transformational shift in policy, all of which produces this jump up to a higher level of trade than we'd ever seen before. I guess what I take from that story is that the notion that trade always has to keep on rising as a share of world production is wrong. Specific events cause that jump. In fact, even the interwar period when trade declined, there's a reasonable amount of evidence that it's not just protectionism and wars. That was a period when technological progress in transportation seems to have somewhat lagged technological progress in the economy at large, which meant that the real cost of transportation rose. It's always the comparative that matters. And so there was a period of when trade did not grow, which makes it entirely possible that we've entered an era where it will stop growing again. And gosh, I'm really missing my pièce de résistance. We have the specific kind of trade that grew from this hyperglobalization was north-south trade. It was taking pieces of the value chain, putting them in low-wage countries. And if that is what's going on, then you might have hoped. The question would be: is this true? Does the world get flatter in all directions? Does all kind of trade grow? And the answer, even during the period of hyperglobalization, is not. So we don't have proper data on interregional trade within the United States, but we do have shipments. We have basically from the transportation department. We have information on shipments of goods, and we can get a value of shipments between states and do it in constant dollars. So I'll read them. So if you look between. The dates end up being idiosyncratic because those are the dates for which we have the reports. From 97 to 2011, the volume of U.S. trade, international trade, rose 81%. The volume of interregional trade appears to have gone up only about 25%, which is less than the growth of GDP over the period, which is about 37%. So interregional trade did not grow faster than GDP. In fact, a little bit slower. We seem to have I don't know if this has anything to do with the decline in labor mobility, but anyway, we seem to have actually had less growth in the amount of stuff being shipped back and forth across the United States than the growth in trade. All of which says to me that it's a reasonable guess that pause that we see after about the pause that we see where, having emerged from the Great Recession, we nonetheless do not see a resumption of the upward march of trade, may well be not a blip, but in fact, the curve has now flattened out, maybe even turned downward slightly. All right, what does that say about income distribution? On global income distribution, the question becomes how much of the rise in inequality within the advanced countries, how much of the narrowing of international income gaps is tied to this ever-growing trade. We don't know, but to the extent that it is, we might be seeing a return to the kind of growth patterns that we had before, which is a good thing if it means less rise in inequality here, a bad thing if it means less catch-up by developing countries. And you can see just the ghost. If you look at what's going on, the ghost of the kind thing that we used to say was the reason that China could never replicate the experience of Hong Kong. We used to say, well, China, there just isn't enough labor-intensive stuff to export for them to be able to get into that game. Well, it turns out there was, largely, I think, because the vertical disintegration of production meant that there was a lot more labor-intensive export possibility. But now you're definitely seeing developing countries getting into the position of competing with each other, and where there seems to be a bit of a hit to the first movers in this as the later movers come on. I've been when I'm trying to not pay attention to events here, I've been looking at things like the growing Bangladesh-China apparel competition. The Chinese are getting themselves priced out of clothing exports, and Bangladesh is picking up a lot of the slack. So that's a real issue. Now, whether it's enough to actually mean an end to rapid economic progress in developing countries, I hope not. But you might want to say maybe the prospects are not for as much spectacular growth as we've seen in the past. And to the extent that we have ever-growing imports of manufactured goods being a source of downward pressure on wages for some workers here, that may be a story that's behind us, not in front of us. Okay, events here. I have nothing particular more to say. You all know what I think on political developments. One question I think one might want to ask is whether. No. Sorry, let's just kill it. One question we might want to ask about these stories about trade is, well, could we be having another interwar period of sharply reduced trade, not just a leveling off, but could we be seeing? So now that the guy who said he was going to, end all of those unfair trade deals is going to be sitting in the White House. Are we actually going to see a huge, a wholesale return to protectionism, ripping up our trade treaties? And of course, the general question on all policy predictions right now is God knows. I don't know he doesn't know what he's going to do. But my guess is that given the nature of this rise in trade, it's very unlikely that it will actually that there'll be any wholesale ripping up of trade agreements, because once the reality is it's not Mexico and China taking advantage of us, sinks in, and you start to ask, what would repealing NAFTA actually involve? At this point, we have, because it's all about this vertical disintegration, we have this tightly integrated, extremely complex North American manufacturing complex. And if you say, well, okay, now let's just rip out that agreement, you're going to have a lot of auto company executives, other people coming in and saying, you're destroying the whole. We can't do this. And I think in the end, that's probably just not going to happen. It can be more China as well, although it's a little bit less that it's a single company that has the integrated thing. But China is also going to be a hard sell on that. Of course, somebody, I don't know, has anybody, at some point somebody is going to say, well, if you want to end Chinese currency intervention, they're actually they're actually running down their reserves rapidly to support the renminbi. I'm not sure that that has sunk in just yet as what it will mean in terms of trade policy. Now, in the end, I don't actually think that any of this. Any of these globalization stories has all that much bearing on the right tail of the U.S. income distribution. I think that has much more to do with domestic events, has to do with policy, has to do with financial deregulation, and on that front, I guess, what's the slogan? Fill the swamp. Anyway, it's not going to drain the swamp. Those things are all going to get worse, not better. So that I'm not too sure about. I wouldn't be optimistic about the far end. The basic point here, though, I think is leaving various political economy nightmares, deferring them slightly, is that we probably do want to think of both the process of globalization and some of what went on income distribution during this era since around 1990 as having been a one-time event. That it's very likely that the future will not look very much like the past, and that better in some ways, worse in others, but just different, and don't want to be only looking backwards when we try to understand what happens going forward. End of story. All right.
Thank you very much, Paul. It is impressive with all that's going on for all of us, but especially in your life in multiple roles, that you could focus in such a research and data-minded way, which of course is very fruitful.
It's called running away.
Yeah, fine.
Taking a vacation in my head.
I watch Food Network. We all got our thing.
Yeah.
So let me, before I turn over to our distinguished audience, let me pose a couple questions to you, if I could.
Yeah.
The first thing is, you mentioned the fact that one of the big shifts is the shift from north-north to north-south trade.
Right.
And obviously some of the work you did with others was all about explaining prior to this shift why there was so much north-north trade, why there was intra-industry trade, for example. Can you just reflect a little bit on how much of a surprise this is to you versus, and what does that say about the nature of comparative advantage? Because, I mean, it was a very big deal when you did your oligopolistic models and said that there was brand differences and all these things that led to north-north trade. What went away?
Actually, it's funny, 'cause I was looking back. You read some of the papers I was publishing in the early 80s. I actually said even then, this is a story about what has happened so far, and there's reason to believe that we'll be seeing a return to comparative advantage type trade looking forwards. Because even though we didn't, China was still, or had barely, we didn't know what was going to happen to China. We already, the term newly industrializing economies is actually a late 70s term. Because around 77, 78, people recognized that something different was happening in South Korea and Taiwan. So that was it's not really a surprise or a shock to say that, okay, that the kinds of stuff that happened with the formation of the common market or the U.S. Canada Auto Pact was not going to be the story looking forwards. But and I'm not sure there's anything particularly exotic about it. The question you would ask is why, in a way, why was comparative advantage type trade held back for so long? And I think that's got multiple reasons: trade policy, import substitution in developing countries. But it shouldn't be. It's certainly not intellectually disturbing to see that it did make a comeback. Now, there's interesting stuff within that, which again, my equivalent of watching cat videos or something is to think about these other issues, right? I don't want to think about what really matters. And there's a lot more than just straight comparative advantage going on, even in the North-South trade. There's a tremendous amount of external economies, industry clustering that goes on in developing countries. China is wonderful if you like stories about industry agglomerations. China has there's a whole city that makes most of the world's buttons, and the story about how that happened. It's one thing I guess I would say is that the post-war, the 30 glorious years, as the French would say, was a period which also, for one of the things that we didn't realize, I think, it was that the ease of having a pro-trade consensus was much greater than it should normally be, because so much of the growth in trade was this non-comparative advantage trade. And now we're back in a world where Stolper-Samuelson type things apply.
Building on that, there were a number of things going on in the linkages between globalization, increased trade, and income inequality, as you mentioned. I think it is. Yeah. So one thing I'm wondering about is we have a world in which you understandably emphasize sort of the broad picture across the world, which of course is what Branko and the elephant diagram do. But there is some cross-sectional variation, right? I mean, Germany was far more globalized than the U.S. to begin with. Japan was far less globalized, and they had different patterns on this. Do you find those second order, or is there stuff there we should think about?
I think actually, think about Canada, U.S. Some of the thing, the stuff that the non-competitive market issues depend a lot on institutional legal structure, on bargaining power. Canada retains a much higher share of private sector unionization than we do. And they do that essentially because the politics were different. And that has some effect, or to put it, manufacturing is it's going to be less easy for workers to establish bargaining power in manufacturing because of globalization. But service sector is not inherently impossible for unions, as we see in much of the OECD, but not in the United States. You could have unionized workers, you could have bargaining power. So the possibility of having higher wages for the bottom 70% of the workforce in the service sector is still very much there, despite whatever's been going on. And then, yeah, I mean, we had a brief moment when we seem to be having a much more high-minded discussion than we're going to be having now. But when we're, question with how applicable is the Danish model to the United States? And Denmark is every bit as exposed to global competition as the United States, but has both a much more empowered workforce and a much larger tax and transfer system and it does that without any visible cost, right? I mean, the employed share of the prime age population is higher in Denmark by a substantial margin than it is here. So there's plenty of leeway within these forces, and I don't mean at all to suggest that there's nothing that you can do.
Yeah. I know, Brad, you're waiting, but I got a couple more, I'm afraid. In terms of following up on that, one thing that I think has concerned many of us in the Trump purported trade agenda, which is, of course, only a small subset of the things that concern people. But within the Trump trade agenda is this sort of romanticization of
that's something I meant to say, yeah.
Of steel workers or of dirty industries or of things that go with macho men being the breadwinner. And to me, this was encapsulated when he did a rally in Pittsburgh talking about how he's going to bring back steel, totally ignoring the wealth of high value added services that have developed in Pittsburgh over the last 30 years.
Yeah.
So there are people who, including on the left, who are very romantic about that image. I mean, how do you see this idea of sort of nostalgia for old industries? How should we be thinking about that as a serious?
Well, in a way, I almost hope they try it, because it would be such a spectacular dud. I mean, now I don't have the numbers in front of me, but if you, U.S. has a significant trade deficit in manufactured goods. So imagine that you could just, by force majeure, zero out that trade deficit in manufactured goods. That would mean more manufacturing jobs, but first of all, not as much as even the trade deficit number would suggest, because only something like 60% of the value of manufacturers' trade is actually manufacturing value added. So I did some homework, and it came down to it being a rough estimate, ignoring all the possible negative fallout, but assuming that it went smoothly, completely zeroing out manufacturers' trade balance would add maybe 15% to manufacturing employment. So manufacturing is now, I think, on the order of 10%.
Right.
The golden, the era when America was great, was manufacturing was 35%. Somehow getting from 10 to 11.5 is not exactly going to be what people have in mind. And of course, that's true even more if you think about the non-coal. Until very recently, all of the decline in coal employment had nothing whatsoever to do with decline in demand for coal. It had to do with actually largely just shifting to Western strip mining and instead of Appalachian deep mines. But yeah, manufacturing, the idea that the world doesn't need it's a little bit like it's a little bit like imagining that you could somehow bring back the days when 60% of the workforce wasn't farming. We just can't eat enough to do that. So no, at a fundamental level, it's a really. Some people on the left, I think, have this problem too. If restoring a decent society means restoring the kind of manufacturing-oriented workforce that we had, then it ain't going to happen, because trade is not the story about why we have so few manufacturing workers now.
Thank you. One final question before I turn it to the audience. The story you told, your 3 bullets about what were explanatory factors about the link between trade, globalization, and income inequality not being so big before, being potentially bigger explanations now. I mean, there's a lot of merit, obviously. But it also was a story that basically omitted any discussion of capital flows, savings glut, changes in investment. So it may be just the real things determine income inequality and these matter, but is it totally unimportant, Chinese savings behavior or currency misalignments or the foreign exchange regime that we live in a system of floating rates? None of that matters?
Okay, I don't think that there was a period when Chinese currency manipulation actually was a problem. That was about 6 years ago. But that has ceased to be the story now. There is, I have a somewhat different story in my mind, which is not really one about bad behavior, especially, although for what it's worth, if you wanted to pick out somebody that clearly has what amounts to an undervalued currency and is running huge surpluses that are destructive, it would actually be Germany now. Yep. But the no, I'm a totally different. I'm a serious secular stagnationist. In fact, I'm actually quite pissed because I tried to lay out that position, did it incoherently and incomprehensibly, and then Larry Summers gave a crystal clear speech explaining what it was all about, and so he gets all the credit and deserves it, which is what makes me really mad. And one of the things that is the most convincing case for a secular stagnation argument right now is not us, but the Europeans. Right. I mean, Japan, I think, has been there for a long time. This is the European working age population is shrinking. Lots of reasons to believe that they are fundamentally in a state of inadequate demand. But under a floating exchange rate regime, someone who's got persistent weakness of demand is going to have a persistently weak currency, and they're going to export the problem to the rest of us. So I think we are, in effect, end up importing. We probably have a tendency in that direction anyway. We end up importing the stagnation of Europe as well. So that's a real issue, and it adds. Not sure how it plays on income distribution, although it does look kind of as if weak economies are. You might have thought that I guess it's not ex ante obvious that they would hit wages more than profits, but that seems to be the way it works out, and given the market power we have, and so this just adds on to the problem. But all of these things are likely, to be a kind of second order compared to all the other stuff that's now coming down the pike. So we've all been on vacation for the past 45 minutes, but right. Yeah,
we can get to that now. Brad.
Okay, let me distinguish between super vulgar Trumpism. We can get back to 24% of the non-farm labor force in manufacturing, and that would be a good thing. Vulgar Trumpism, it's all lousy trade deals and TPP and NAFTA and China's accession to the WTO. And even though there are big technology things, we'd have a lot more manufacturing jobs if we hadn't done those bad trade deals, and Trump will do good trade deals that will make everything fine, even though we won't get all the jobs back. And then intelligent Trumpism, which is that the TPP, NAFTA, and China WTO are very small things as far as their effects on the manufacturing workforce. What's a big thing is the strong dollar policy, the fact that the U.S., rather than being a high savings, lower investment, capital exporting country, is a savings scarce country. That's pushed our manufacturing share of employment down from 12% to 9% and carried with it a huge collapse in blue-collar wages. And the argument against that, intelligent Trumpism, as I see it, is the German one. That Germany's done everything right as far as nurturing its manufacturing production workforce and supporting its communities of engineering practice are concerned. Its manufacturing export surplus is massive. And yet, as we saw earlier, its 20th percentile and its 50th percentile have been doing badly, albeit not as badly as here. Now, the rise of the overclass, income stagnation, inadequate social insurance.
Is there a question, Brad?
There's a question.
Okay.
Polanyian disruptions of patterns of life. Pascal Lamy says, when the wise man points at the moon, the fool looks at the fingers. Globalization is the finger. Market capitalism is the moon. I want to know if Paul will give me a license to fly my neoliberal freak flag in good conscience and take the U.S.-German comparison as a license to be both a good social democrat at home and a good rootless cosmopolite globalist internationally, or do I have to do some powerful rethinking here?
Okay. let me give you what I should have said. So the flip side. Imagine that that Trump gets ready to rip up all our trade deals, and in come a parade of big U.S. Executives saying, this will be catastrophic. But my belief is that, in fact, they will dissuade him from that. That the only things that will not be only things that only hurt poor people will actually happen. But maybe not. Maybe he doesn't recognize any of these people because doesn't read this briefing book that explains to him why he should be listening to them. Whatever. If you did rip up the whole system of global trading agreements, the payoff would be small. To even leaving aside the fallout, the payoff in terms of actually raising wages of U.S. blue-collar workers would be fairly small. Even with everything I've said, it's still not going to be. It's not going to bring manufacturing employment back up to the levels of 30 years ago. It's not going to bring a radical narrowing of income distribution, a radical rise in real wages. The place where you would have very large effects would, in fact, be poor countries. So that whenever somebody says to me about what this globalization has been a bad thing, my immediate question is how is Bangladesh supposed to survive, literally, without access to reasonably open world markets? Right? It's a country that more or less literally is keeping its head above water by exporting labor-intensive. And so if we have a global trade war, U.S. would become a little bit poorer. Possibly some people in the U.S. would become a little bit less poor, though others would be poorer. But the impact on developing, on still very poor countries would be catastrophic. No, and this comes back to the elephant diagram. I mean, when we ask, is this picture a good thing or a bad thing? When I was in grad school, I came in thinking, well, what I should do is development economics, because that's what really matters. It's what's really important for the human race. But I didn't because it was too depressing. This is mid-1970s, and development economics was basically non-development economics. It was about why don't countries develop. There hadn't been any real success stories. And then all of these amazing success stories come after that. And even though they have some downward pressure on wages of blue-collar workers in the advanced world, surely stepping back and adopting your rootless cosmopolitan position, you say, this has got to be a great, good thing for the human race. Of course, I guess the response of some of the people who just did what they did would be kind of like the responses that come in my Twitter feed.
But leaving aside that nadir of human behavior, I mean, let's at least also posit that some of the people who did what they did or who were against trade would have to admit that if you're not providing poor countries and other countries with opportunities, the prospects for instability, for military conflict, for all these other things also go up, presumably.
Yeah, although I really hate doing that particular line of argument because
Okay.
it's too easily. I always thought that one of the most embarrassing things that everything looks now trivial compared with recent events, but when the attempt by Bob Zoellick to sell Doha as a national security anti-terrorism, that was embarrassing. That was kind of silly, right? And we don't know enough about those connections to the reason to do these things is just the general sense that a world in which poor people in poor countries have some prospect of improvement is a better world, without being too specific about whether it's going to pay for itself by reducing the need for a bigger Marine Corps or something.
Okay, at the back mic, and then Fred.
Hi, I'm Vikram Nehru from the Carnegie Endowment and Johns Hopkins SAIS, and I want to ask you a question about the future of globalization. I mean, two potential areas where you could argue that the future of globalization is likely to continue. The first is South-South trade. I mean, especially in Asia, there's increasing cross-border infrastructure development that's taking place and so forth, which potentially is going to lead to substantial increases in trade within Asia, not just between Asia and the advanced economies. And secondly, services trade. I mean, services is perhaps the fastest growing part of global trade. Right now, most countries have relatively restrictive services sectors, including, for example, China. But I think the trend is very much towards increasing liberalization of services. And with digitization and information technologies, one would expect that services could potentially explode across borders. I'd like your reaction to that.
And I should just note that our colleague Brad Jensen, who's both at Georgetown and here at the Institute, has done some very detailed work on the potential for huge expansion in services trade.
Yeah. Don't want to say no, that there can't be a lot more services trade. But I know actually Jensen work is, it cuts both ways. One of the things that they do in that work is they look essentially at interregional trade within the United States to determine what's tradable. And the fact of the matter is most metropolitan area economies in the United States are still overwhelmingly the bulk of the workforce is producing stuff that's non-tradable domestically, right? Most people working in Metro New York are not producing goods for people outside.
No, they don't claim otherwise.
Right. That's right. But that tells you that there's kind of a limit, that we're going to be a world in which 70-80% of employment is services and a few goods that don't actually enter into international trade. So maybe there can be some more, but I don't. Actually, one of the things that struck me is the talk about dramatic, transformative growth in services trade. I was actually looking from among my many balls and chains to wear is 10th edition of my old international textbooks. I'm trying to update, and a lot of this stuff is actually 10 years old. So this is not something brand new. I'm not going to say that trade can't rise to a higher level, but our notion that you always have an onward, upward, that the elasticity of trade with respect to GDP, which I think is actually a really poor concept, but anyway, but it's always two. That's not true. That's a post 1950 story, which is actually not something that you can extrapolate heading forwards.
Okay.
Paul, welcome back to the Institute. Great to see you here again.
It's Fred Bergston, by the way.
Yes.
Thank you.
Like everyone else, he still has to say his name.
Thank you. I'll let you do it. Paul, it's clear that a lot of the body politic does not believe you or us at the Institute or other right-minded people when we tell them about all the great gains from trade. So my question to you as the premier trade theorist of this era is whether our models have something to do with that. Whether our workhorse model, the CGE model, in a way assumes away the questions that are interesting politically. Effect on jobs in the short to medium run, effect on trade balances, those things are assumed away in the models. Do you think that's part of the current problem? And if so, if there's anything that can be done about it?
Okay. Let's see if I can be coherent here. I'll try. First thing to say is that a lot of what the public thinks economists have to say about this does not actually come out of the models. Our basic trade models definitely have are by no means Pollyanna-ish. They don't say trade is great, it's all good, it's all fabulous. But the public thinks that's what economists say, and maybe because, in fact, all too often in the public sphere, that is what they say. Actually, Alan Blunders who's a wonderful economist and very balanced commentary on these things. But yeah, I remember he said if there was a single economic slogan that we would all agree on, that you could put on a T-shirt, it would be "Yay, free trade." And yet that's not actually what, in trade economics you should say. You should say, well, there's potential gains. I think we probably oversell. We probably have oversold. Not that the models are wrong. We oversold even what the models themselves say. Then on top of that, I don't think there's any impact on what the public thinks. But the CGE models that we used for assessing, it's the old remark about knowing what goes into political decisions. The public must never know that, and what goes into sausage, and what actually goes into CGE modeling of trade agreements is they are not. There's an amazing amount of just assumptions, guesstimates, and there's been a little bit of retrospective work. What do people say in advance of a trade agreement about what it's going to deliver, and what do they say in assessments 20 years later? And it's not very flattering to the economics profession. Sorry. So that was going to have 3 points, but let me give you a 2.5 point, which is that something like TPP is it's not even for the most part a trade agreement. It's mostly about dispute settlement and intellectual property, and we're sort of appropriating undeservedly the name of Ricardo to justify something which may be defensible but is not really about that mostly. And then the last point is, look, the public disbelieves lots of things that economists and other people say, and it disbelieves them often despite being right. I mean, if you ask how many people believe that fiscal stimulus that running bigger budget deficits is a good thing to do in the face of recessions, I'm sure it's a quite distinct minority of the public, and yet that's a position that's been overwhelmingly confirmed by events. Our basic, ISLM macro has actually worked stunningly well since 2008, but nobody knows that or believes it. Of course, nobody even knows what it is. So I don't think there are reasons for the lack of credibility of economists on free trade, but I don't think they have very much at all to do with the fact that the underlying trade models are a bad thing. I think it's just both that, just to a limited extent, we've told a narrative that isn't actually based on the analysis, but mostly, people just your ability to get basically anything across to the general public. I think maybe most people in our profession think if only I had a platform where I could talk to millions of people, then I could get these things across. Let me tell you, I've been running that experiment for 16 years, and it don't work so good.
Hi, Ralph Carter with FedEx. Really enjoyed the conversation. Donald Trump has obviously made China a big issue. He said that China's been ripping us off for years. We've just gone through a list of things that might say otherwise, or at least indicate that we're looking behind us rather than in front of us. The China shock largely over. We've said that you can't bring back those manufacturing jobs in steel, even if you put 45% tariffs on them. And currency, they're now propping up their currency. So if he were to call you and say, what should our policy, our trade prescriptions be for China going forward, what would you say?
I don't think we need a change. I think there's a China problem out there, but at this point it has very little to do with their currency. Has very little to do with trade policy, or certainly with their currency policy. And I mean, China looks to me like the thing we should be fearing is not their excessive success at our expense, but now looking forward, the real possibility that they are going to go off a cliff themselves. I mean, China 2016 looks to me kind of like Japan 1989 without the social cohesion. So it's I mean, what I would say, not that I would have a chance of of being heard, but is trade is not where it's at. If they're just if you want a better global environment, try and persuade the Germans to accept the notion of European fiscal stimulus.
That's something others of us have been trying for 16 years.
I know. That's the other. If you wanted, there are lots of interesting. If you wanted to actually ask who are the countries that are following what are clearly inappropriate policies from the point of view of global interests right now, believe it or not, China is not high on the list. Germany is a big one. South Korea has become an interesting drag on the world economy. So, but not, it was made a lot of sense to beat up on China in 2010. I don't think it makes any sense now.
Quick follow-up.
Just what about the industrial policies, state-led economics, and lack of progress in moving towards market economy?
Well, yeah,
The question was, what about the industrial policies, state-owned enterprises, lack of progress to market?
Yeah, no, China, in that way, China is a little bit like Japan 20-something years ago, where I'm not sure how much of our problems, I think it's got to be really marginal, can be attributed to Chinese intervention, support of industries, but it certainly poisons the well of international relations to have them so clearly not willing to let the market ever speak, accept its verdict.
Great, thank you. At the back mic, then here, and then there. Back mic is you.
Oh, okay.
I
wanted to add, my name is Kim Frankena. I'm from GAO, and I wanted to essentially complement the question that just got asked. We have a kind of a consequential year ahead of us. Obviously, there's a potential that one of the biggest trade agreements that's been negotiated might be left in whatever state it is. There's a WTO ministerial in December. There's a president that wants to do something about trade. What would you recommend he do in the coming year?
Oh boy, find a way to change the subject, I think, because trade is just not going to do what he wants it to do. Trade policy is not going to do what he wants to do. It's although I on second thought, if I think about the things he might do to change the subject, maybe better to have him go after trade agreements. So better to go after trade agreements than after Muslims in America or something. So, but that's no, really, I don't. It is, or maybe focus on bringing down those record levels of crime in the inner city, which don't actually exist, but maybe less harm done in the process of trying to deal with that imaginary problem.
No, I mean, seriously, Krugman's fabulous one-liner aside, I mean, ultimately, the type of trade discussions and analysis that the people working for and with Mr. Trump have engaged in are fundamentally wrong. I don't mean just,
Yeah,
we
not that's
don't
a
like
bad
them.
idea.
It's just...
It's not that these are poorly thought out policy proposals. They're dealing with fantasy problems in a world that bears no resemblance to the world we actually live in.
And so the discussion, it's kind of like a global warming discussion. If they deny the reality, it's very hard to imagine what you can advise them to do. I'm not in any way disputing you're saying that we have to try to meet that challenge. But again, I don't want to take time away from Paul, but just to be clear, we did do the analysis, Marcus Nolan, Sherman Robinson, Gary Huffbauer, Tyler Moran, here at the Institute, on what, if you actually did their policies, what it would look like. And it's terrible. And Peter Navarro and Wilbur Ross and others have debated me and others who were authors on the study and said, that's not how it's going to work. Not debated us and said, oh, your calculations are wrong for this reason, or, oh, we value this more than that, this is going to help this constituency. No, just, it's not going to happen. Well, I think Paul said it. It's not true. And so there is a limit. We can try to have rational discourse in this room, and I hope in many places beyond this room, but if the Trump people, if President-elect, I should be proper, if the President-elect's administration chooses to believe in nonsense, there's only so much you can do.
Actually, maybe
I know that Congress, I think, is interested in trying to play its historic role in this area. And as a result, I think not just advice to President Trump, but also for the country more generally would be helpful. But in any case, I thank you for answering.
Yeah, I want to say that there is a problem, and this is it's actually, I found, it was interesting, I found myself having a dialogue with Glenn Hubbard, and I don't usually agree on very much, but we were both fully agreeing that we now have the prospect of an administration that fundamentally doesn't believe in expertise on anything. If you know something about a subject, then that makes you inherently the enemy. And partly that's because they have gone out so far on a limb on so many things, said so many things that aren't true. But also, basically, anybody who has an independent position as an expert is not reliable, because you might actually at some point take a stand on conscience or feel that you needed to defend your reputation. So the idea that we're going to get some people who really understand trade or national security or anything else in a position to give slightly less horrible advice than that's a fantasy. It's going to be complete. I believe it's going to be a complete shambles on every front, and which, by the way, means that maybe my proposition that we're not actually going to rip up NAFTA because it's crazy may be a bad prediction, because if unless somebody can make that case first of all, can get into the room and can make that case in not more than 3 minutes. It may be that we'll just do crazy stuff, but there'll be nobody to say, hey, that won't work.
Yeah. Here, please, and then there.
Yeah, Carolyn Freund, Peterson Institute. I just want to first make a small comment, and then I have a question, which is just be careful with the elephant chart, because that point B at the bottom is partly or largely driven actually by the former Soviet Union countries.
Okay.
So it really, calling that the OECD really overstates, and I think that chart is getting sold as a demonization of globalization. That chart really just shows global inequality, and I think it's really important that we remember that. My question is about technology and trade. So skill-biased technology does many of the same things as trade, and I think most of us would wear a shirt saying, yay, technology. My son certainly would. And I think the reason trade gets such a hard hit is because it's the foreigner. So going back to your comment about change the topic, maybe the worst policy would be hitting the Muslim immigrants or other people. I think trade is also, it's about the foreign. So do you think part of the rhetoric around trade now is really xenophobia and not about the actual economic consequences about trade and about the rise of China? China's now, a bigger economy than us, maybe the decline of an empire, losing our standing. So I just think we need to broaden the discussion about trade. Is it really about those 2 million manufacturing workers?
Yeah, I would agree that I would actually go a bit further. Trade in general plays an outsized role in discussion. Both ways, by the way. Although I hate people who say both sides, but it's not a moral equivalence. But blaming trade for everything that goes wrong is a very, very common fallacy across history and right now, and it is because it's foreigners, because people have the wrong frame where they think of trade as a struggle for advantage between countries, when to the extent that there are adverse effects of trade, they overwhelmingly involve distribution of income within countries, not China winning at our expense, but some workers gaining and others losing within this country. It's also true on the converse side that not nearly equivalent in moral terms, but that economists, I think, tend to emphasize the benefits of trade, of free trade, more than it deserves, partly because you're leaning against that public perception, and partly because comparative advantage is one of the crown jewels intellectually of the field, the demonstration that two countries both gain even if one is better than the other. And in reality, trade probably much of the time just a lot less important than we like to imagine. I mean, I used to complain, actually, that the U.S., it's about right, the U.S. spends roughly the same share of GDP on imports and on healthcare, right? And which of those is most distorted? Which of those has the most potential for gain if we did it better? Imports or it's probably 2 orders of magnitude difference. That fixing the way we do healthcare is a vastly more important subject. And yet, of course, if you go across university economics departments, basically everybody has to have a trade economist, and very few have a health economist. So we've got a generally misplaced priority. And then, of course, if you end up with somebody in charge for whom everything is about dominance and who wins and who can be humiliated, then trade plays perfectly into that emotional state.
Gentleman there.
Yes, Paul, my name is Ted Knutson. I'm a freelance writer, and even more dangerously, probably the only layperson in the room. So what's going to happen when all these Trump voters who went to the polls angry about the loss of American jobs to low-wage countries leave the polls and then immediately go to Walmart for the low prices that are made possible by, guess what? The goods are being manufactured, in low-wage countries. So, what happens when this realization hits in, and do you think there's going to be more jobs brought here, which will lead to more inflation, which will decrease the standard of living for many people?
It's a really interesting question. What's going to happen? Because the campaign promises are ludicrous, and nothing like them is going to happen. But how that dynamic plays out, I mean, you'd like to think, okay, so there's the public says, oh my God, we were conned. Let's go. It might not work that way. I mean, what can I say? When I if you think about global experience with authoritarian regimes that make economic promises and don't manage to deliver, fairly often they deal with that by finding someone to demonize or by invading the Falklands or something, and it's sort of not. So it might be quite explosive. Put it this way: if you want to think about what happens when, after a couple of years, it becomes clear that Trumponomics was nonsense. If you just want to think that that the public wakes up, I think I hope so, but I wouldn't count on it being nearly that smooth.
Thank you. Before I go to the mic, I just want to follow up on that. We focused, and I appreciate your willingness to focus, even if it's for selfish cap play reasons, on these international trade issues. But you just mentioned something. So there is this issue in Trumponomics that at least potentially we could get a very large fiscal stimulus out of a unified Congress and Mr. Trump's proposals, or at least some variant of Mr. Trump's proposals. And whether it's you or Summers or others, myself included, who've been advocating fiscal stimulus, maybe this has a good effect. So this isn't about who gets credit for what, but how much do you think, if they were to pass a fiscal stimulus, that actually creates not just a short-term burst, but alleviates secular stagnation, does other benefits, and actually does get some good things happening?
Yeah. All right. If we look at the actual Trump, the alleged Trump proposals, I've actually just been reading about getting up to speed on infrastructure, and that is shocking. That's complete garbage. I mean, it's tax credits for corporations to do, and it's not. And a lot of it would not even be. There would be no additionality. A lot of things that companies were already spending on would they just get tax breaks. The amount of additional infrastructure investment we get out of it would be probably minimal. So I think there's nothing there. That's just a handout. What is there is giant tax cuts. And if the number is huge, right? The number that's in the proposal is about $4.5 trillion over a decade, which is a 2% of GDP. Basically, as for the next 10 years, every year, as much addition to debt as a share of GDP as the Recovery Act at its peak. So that's a huge thing. Now, the thing is, it's extremely ineffective. A good part of it is tax cuts to corporations, which, given everything we know, does nothing. Right? Corporations are sitting on large piles of cash. The extent to which their cash availability or even cost of capital affects their investment decisions is really minimal. So the piece that's for corporations is actually a complete wipeout. The money given to rich people will, some of it would be spent. And so you would be getting, now, as somebody who said, look, we're a depressed enough economy, or we were, that even completely pointless spending would be a plus, I have to say, well, look, that's something of a plus. I would not be surprised to see growth over the next 2 years be higher than it was before. But it's going to be a hugely wasteful form of stimulus. I mean, I'm trying to come up with a dingbat stimulus. I don't know, something. It's stimulus that is about as poorly designed as stimulus can be, but it would nonetheless be stimulus. Now, one thing I'm thinking about right now, and we're going to learn a lot, I think, in the next few weeks, is if the other piece, if the kind of deal that's made is huge tax cuts for the wealthy, which do a little bit but not much, huge tax cuts for corporations, which I think do nothing, and then savage cuts in social programs, Medicaid, block granted and shrunk, Medicare, the guarantee of Medicare, converted into a voucher system, and I think everyone will understand that this means, oh my God, I'm no longer secure. Then the negative effect just on spending of the mix, even if it increases the deficit, the effect on spending as a whole may well be negative. So it's quite possible that by Inauguration Day, we'll be looking at what is clearly actually a fiscal contraction, a fiscal contraction that achieves the miracle of actually increasing the debt, even as it does so. But we don't know. We'll have to see how that works out. But I think if you want to think about, I think this comes back in a way. We're now seeing a meshing of two agendas, which is completely the tax cut thing, which I think is largely coming out of Trump's own desire to have people like him, well, not people, he doesn't pay any taxes anyway, but have other people like him not pay any, much in the way of taxes, and then the Ryan agenda, which is basically finding those who afflicting the afflicted. Then we're going to be that could actually end up being anti-stimulus, but we'll see. We'll know more about that in the near future.
Great. Last question, please.
Bill Klein, here at the Institute. Paul, some of the models that showed a huge adverse effect of the Trump plan had not only the trade part, but even the fiscal was so large, as in the Moody's model. If you run that model and only do the fiscal, you get the output coming down to zero growth by 2019. Now, that's driven by these huge magnitudes of these deficits. The debt goes from 80% to 105% of GDP, et cetera. And what it begs, to my mind, is for an analysis of what's the optimal fiscal stimulus at this point. And if you posit you've got your secular stagnation, okay, how much can you bring people back into the labor force from stimulus? But if we posit that, the huge stimulus, even without considering whether it goes to the right people who are going to spend it, could boost up the interest rates, give you a real shock on interest rates 4 or 5 years down the road, then there has to be an optimal amount of fiscal stimulus somewhere in between there. Or maybe you don't agree that there's ever a possible negative sign. And Brad is certainly right to say that you don't just look at the total, but you look at the price. But if you do the CBO projections, the baseline interest rate in most of those projections doesn't stay where it is now. So the price is someday going to go back up. So I guess I'm trying to follow up on that question as to how we think about the optimal fiscal strategy, not that there's much chance it would be followed, but there is some reality, it seems to me, to the eventual return to higher interest rates and to a constraint from just the fiscal stimulus.
Yeah. Okay. Boy, I want to give a whole lecture here, so let me see if I can.
You're welcome to come back tomorrow and give
Yeah.
another lecture. That's fine.
In general, I mean, it's certainly true that the fiscal policy case is a lot weaker than it was 5 years ago. The U.S. economy is pretty close to full employment right now. I would argue that because of uncertainty, because we're still very close to the zero lower bound, that the case for fiscal stimulus doesn't just slam off at the moment that you reach the point where the Fed is ready to raise rates. That there's a sort of precautionary case for having some fiscal stimulus to give the Fed room to move off zero, so that if something bad happens, it can come back down. So I think there is a case for an intelligent fiscal stimulus of 1 or 2 points of GDP, even once you've reached full employment under current conditions. But that case is made a lot stronger if it's actually infrastructure spending that's going to benefit the supply side of the economy further down the pike. Not, I think, what we're going to see happening. The effect on, now the question about buildup of debt and interest rates. We have one precedent of persistent deficits, rising debt in a country that however, borrows in its own currency and faces something that looks like secular stagnation. Of course, that's Japan. And in Japan, anybody waiting for people still say, JGB shorting is the widowmaker trade. It's year after year, it keeps not happening. However, we might say that that's what happens if you have a country that is run by a stable government with reasonably sane people, and we really don't have much in the way at all of evidence on what would happen in our own circumstance. So I guess that I'm not ready to go out there and say that I know that the Trump tax plan would end up being contractionary after X number of years. But if there's any way to have fiscal deficits end up being contractionary in an economy that, even though it's still pretty close to the zero lower bound right now, it would be to do it this way. It would be to have tax cuts that go to exactly the wrong people and are not part of any coherent or even halfway rational economic policy. That's and coupled with, let's not forget that the president-elect as a candidate said, well, we can deal with U.S. debt by just negotiating it, right? They thinks that they can deal with U.S. Federal debt the way you deal with a failing hotel and make sure that somebody else pays. So that's a that's right, Trump the real estate developer. So yeah, so there's a real question. I feel that I have been urging people who are horrified by all of this not to expect instant gratification. Don't, if you're going to stake everything on on this stuff spectacularly falling apart next year, you might be right, but you might be not right and don't want to spend your credibility on that projection.
The Brexit error.
What?
The Brexit error.
Yeah, that's right, Brexit. Which was, in fact, on Brexit, I actually was pretty much out there on my own saying I don't buy this recession call, and for about 36 hours, I was willing to say a Trump recession, but I was wrong, and I quickly retracted it because I don't think that we can count on that. And this is going to be terrible stuff. I mean, if you ask how will the United States economy in 2026 look or actually maybe 2024, how will it look compared with how it would have looked without James Comey? It's going to be terrible, but don't count on it happening right away.
Very good. We can count on you to give us lots to think about. Thank you for engaging with our audience and returning to the Pearson Institute. This meeting is adjourned.